"Now then," said the captain, "I'm Jake Foston, captain of this team. This is our cricket pitch. I always fetch his new lads out to have a look at it because it's not a normal one. It's a good pitch, mind. Takes spin very well and is as level as a billiard table top. Our lads have done some good work, but yon outfield is a bit brant." I knew this was the Dalek word for steep and could see how the village got its name. "Now, we can't help that. Nature's made this field and nature's got to be respected. Out in midfield there's an electric fence that's to keep cows off this pitch. It's switched off now, but you'll have to watch it if you have to chase a ball. Leap over it if you can. It's not but a couple of foot high. Beyond that's the real boundary, and yon railings mark it. Through them is 6. "You mean over them, surely?" asked someone from our side. "Nay, through is 6. If a ball goes through there, our lads could run 10 or 15 while you find ball among nettles. So we play fair and allow 6. If you clout it over that fence, then it's 8. "Downhill," he said. "You'll not see boundary 'cause it's out of sight. You'll need a fella down there to call back the score. He'll have to be a bit sharp 'cause he'll not be able to see the batsman, nor can he know when ball's heading his way. So you lads will have to yell at him, 'Ball's coming,' or something like that. Left or right a bit, he'll soon cotton on." Jake continued. "Beyond yon electric fence there's lots of cow claps. If a ball goes in one and stops there, we'll give you 5 runs. That's to let you have time to wipe it clean before chucking it back to your wicketer, and we reckon that's fair. Cow claps are 5. That hen house," and he indicated a hen house tucked in the upper corner, "if you clout that hen house, it's a 6. If it goes inside, it's 8. "It won't be easy fielding in this long grass," a policeman player said guardedly. "No, it's not, but we're used to it," smiled Jake. "And we can't cut it just for a cricket match or two. Our cows need feeding, and this is good cow grass." We followed upon a brief circuit of this unique cricket field, and had no alternative but to agree with Brantgate's interpretation of the rules. We were assured that their scorer, who would sit in the pavilion alongside ours, would keep us informed, and that he was as honest as a new babe. "Now," he said, "there's one other thing." We waited with bated breath. "We're a team member short, lads. One of our best players had to rush off to hospital with his missus. She's calving, he reckons, and he had to take her on his tractor." I tried to visualise the farmer's pregnant wife sitting on a tractor and being rushed off to the maternity ward. "So?" asked Alex Benwell. "We've a player to stand in for him from another team." "I've no objections of you." Alex faced us. We all shook our heads. "Then that's him." And the host team's captain pointed to a sturdy farmer in his 60s. Ebenezer Flintoft wore thick hobnail boots, corduroy trousers lashed around the knees with bits of string, a thick working shirt with no collar and the sleeves rolled above his elbows, red braces and a flat cap. He beamed at us as we stared at him, and I noticed his mouth was devoid of teeth. He needed a shave too, for his chin bristled with grey hairs. "It's father-in-law of our opening bat," announced Jake. "He's over for day, helping out with some pigs, but said he'd help us out if we're stuck." We agreed to this last-minute substitution. The fellow was clearly a non-cricketer and had come along as a goodwill gesture. The rules having been explained, we tossed and lost. Jake elected to bat, and I knew why. We'd have an awful job coping with stray balls in that outfield, and so we did. They knocked our bowling all over the field, causing the ball to get stuck in cow claps, to get fast in the hedge, to get lost in long grass, and to vanish over that hidden boundary below us. Ebenezer Flintoft came in at number 5, and we realised their best batsman had performed. If they were putting Ebenezer into bat at this early stage, the remainder must be rubbish. Sergeant Benwell decided to give our opening bowler another crack at them, fully expecting him to skittle out the remainder for a very low score. But they had expected nothing like Ebenezer. He flung the bat around like lightning, hitting everything that moved. He kept scoring 4s, 6s and 8s with monotonous regularity, and nothing seemed to beat him. He was very evidently having a whale of a time. The others came and went, but Ebenezer returned to the pavilion not out, and beaming all over his whiskery face. "By gum," he said, "I right enjoyed yon knockabout. How many did I get?" He'd scored 125 out of a total of 187. We broke the proceedings for tea. And it was magnificent. The wives of the Brantgate team laid on a gorgeous tea, worthy of any moorland funeral, and we resumed the game shortly after 5 o'clock. We didn't stand a chance of reaching their score. Sergeant Benwell was our opening batsman, and I was amazed to see that Ebenezer was their opening bowler. The large, heavy Yorkshireman took a short run, whirled his arm in a peculiar sideways motion and delivered a ball that utterly beat poor old Benwell. By some luck, he survived the first over and began to score off the second bowler. But when Ebenezer returned, I could see that poor old Sergeant Benwell was struggling. He was clean bowled, with the 4th ball of the second over, and this signified our impending collapse. We did manage a creditable 56, all scored off the other bowlers, because Ebenezer was totally unplayable. We limped back to the pavilion, beaten and trounced by this village team from the moors. But they treated us well. We were invited to the local pub for a friendly drink, and the blacksmith did something to Sergeant Benwell's brakes which made his old truck mobile once again. The way home was jolly and happy as we sang loud songs and told countless jokes. I was to learn later that Ebenezer played for most of the moorland village teams. He lived in an isolated farm which did not belong to any village. Consequently, he was invited to play in several teams. He invariably won the match when they played outsiders, and I wondered how the teams coped if he was supposed to play for both. Knowing how these fellows played, he probably did play for both sides, just to even things out. Sergeant Charlie Bairstow and I were sitting in his official car, discussing the spate of vandalism which had broken out. I was performing a late motorcycle patrol across Rydale, and Sergeant Bairstow had found me just outside Moulton. "Evening, Nick," he greeted me in his usual affable way. "Take your helmet off and sit with me for a few minutes." And that's how I came to be sitting at his side in the tiny police car some distance off my own beat. As we sat and talked, there was a frantic tapping on Sergeant Bairstow's window. "Why, I'm glad I found you, fellas," a thick-set farm youth was addressing us, having quickly opened Sergeant Bairstow's door. "Summat wrong?" Bairstow said. "Aye, Sergeant," the lad said. "In yon barn of ours. There's a man, I reckon he's dead. He's laid out on our straw, and I wouldn't guess how long he's been there." "You've not touched anything?" asked Sergeant Bairstow. "Not a thing, Sergeant, not a thing. I wouldn't touch young fellow for all gold in China." "Come on, show us then." And Sergeant Bairstow opened the rear door. The youth climbed in, smelling strongly of pigs, and guided us to the barn. The lad was called Alan Dudley and farmed for his father. He was on his way to a telephone kiosk when he spotted our conveniently parked car. At the barn he located a storm lantern which he'd left near the entrance and produced matches to ignite the wick. Sergeant Bairstow carried a powerful torch from the car, and together we entered the dark recesses. Alan Dudley guided us to a distant corner. He halted and revealed his find by holding his lantern high to flood the corpse with a dim light. Sure enough, there was the body of a man. He lay in a prone position with his head cradled in his arms and his legs curled up in the fetal position. I guessed he was in his late 40s or early 50s, and he appeared to be a tramp or roadster of some kind. Sergeant Bairstow and I edged forward in the pool of light, treading carefully upon the straw. I watched as my superior squatted on his haunches at the side of the body and touched the whiskery face. "Warm," he said with some relief in his voice. And he's alive." "Alive?" cried Alan Dudley. "He looks dead to me." "He's alive, all right." And Sergeant Bairstow lowered his head to listen for breathing, then swiftly sat upright, holding his nose. "Drink," he sighed. "Meths. This fellow's a meths drinker. He's paralytic. God, he stinks." "We're fetching some sheep in here tonight," said Alan, looking down at the visitor. "He can't stay. Some of the moored rams will half kill him." "Here's our problem, Nick," said Bairstow softly. "It's your car, Sergeant," I reminded him, for my motorcycle was parked nearby. "Help him to the bloody car, then." And with Alan lifting and sweating, and with me hoisting the limp fellow to his feet, we managed to half-carry the limp lump of meth-sodden humanity towards Sergeant Bairstow's car. With much puffing and panting, we squeezed him into the rear seat. The stench in the car was appalling, and I didn't regret being on a motorcycle that night. I wondered what Sergeant Bairstow would do with the fellow, and realised with horror that I was the only constable on duty in this section. The problem could be mine. "Follow me, Nick," Bairstow ordered. I obeyed. I climbed aboard my Francis Barnet and followed the car for about 2 miles. Then he halted. He left his car and approached me as I sat astride my motorcycle, awaiting further instructions. "Nick, old son." Sergeant Bairstow placed one hand on the handlebars of my machine. "This character's yours for the night." "Mine?" I was horrified. I knew what was coming next. "You're the only duty constable in this section tonight, and if we take this character into the police station, he'll have to be placed in the cells because he's drunk and incapable. That means someone has to be present all the time, watching him and caring for him, making sure he doesn't snuff it or hurt himself. Someone has to feed and water him, fetch him his breakfast and minister to his every need." "I'm supposed to finish at 1 o'clock, I reminded him, wondering if I get paid overtime for this duty. "Exactly, Nick. And I'm supposed to finish when I get home in a few minutes' time. And so this fellow is a problem, isn't he? What shall we do with him? Any practical ideas?" "Not really," I had to admit. "Well, I have." He beamed. "Follow me." He started the engine of his little car, turned around and drove towards Moulton. I followed at a discreet distance. I was amazed to see him drive through the centre of the quiet town and across the river. This was sacrilege. We were entering foreign territory now, because we'd left our native North Riding of Yorkshire and were driving into the neighbouring East Riding, then a separate county. In those days, county boundaries were sacrosanct and jealously guarded. There was a great deal of professional jealousy between adjoining police forces, and it was certainly discourteous to invade another chief constable's county without his knowledge. But this did not appear to concern Sergeant Bairstow. He trundled through Norton in our police car and turned into the countryside, with me close behind, ever vigilant for the appearance of an East Riding policeman. If one caught us, we were sunk. After 2 miles, Sergeant Bairstow pulled up outside a barn down a very lonely lane. I eased to a halt behind him. "Nick," he hissed, "there's an old hay barn here. We're in East Riding territory, so be careful. We don't want them to find us. We'll put Meth Morris in this barn and then belt back into North Riding as fast as we can." After 10 minutes of heaving and cursing, we extricated Meth Morris from the car and carried him into the cosy barn. Within 15 minutes we had our guest neatly laid out on a bed of clean new hay. He slumbered blissfully on and curled into his fetal position as we arranged the hay around him to keep him warm. Satisfied that he was slumbering peacefully, we left him to his new abode in the East Riding of Yorkshire. If anyone found him, he would no longer be our problem. His fate rested in the hands of the East Riding Constabulary. Sergeant Bairstow congratulated himself on this piece of strategy, and I followed him home. But after 20 minutes, he pulled into the side of the road and signalled me to halt. I pulled up beside him and he lowered his window. "Nick," he said with a most apologetic tone in his voice, "we've done wrong, you know. This is no way to treat our friends in the East Riding. Just imagine, they'll be lumbered with that smelly old character now. And besides, that barn might not be warm enough. If he dies, we're for it, and I'd never forgive myself." To cut a long story short, Sergeant Bairstow changed his mind and decided to return for the meth drinker. For the second time that night, therefore, we crept into Norton and made our way towards the old barn. I'd parked close to the official car, and together we entered the dark, cold premises. My torch picked out the slumbering form among the hay, and Sergeant Bairstow said, "Right, as before. Get him into the back seat, Nick. I know a nice warm shed next door to a bakery in Malton. We'll put him in there for the night. Somebody from Malton will find him and see to him. They've plenty of accommodation and stuff. That'll satisfy my conscience." What happened next was a most unexpected and unwelcome surprise. As we stooped to lift him from his cosy bed, the fellow suddenly hurtled from the hay and savagely attacked us. He fought like a wild cat, cursing vilely and using his head in an effort to break our noses and cheekbones. He was not going to be taken anywhere. He was shouting that he wanted to be left alone and not taken to prison or hospital. We tried to make him understand it was for his own good. But Sergeant Bairstow's efforts to console him and reassure him were unheeded, and there developed one almighty tussle. But 2 fit policemen are more than a match for a meth drinker in the long term, and in spite of his wild lunges, kicks and butts, we managed to quieten him and take him to our car. He meekly allowed us to sit him in the back. Sergeant Bairstow was nursing a black eye and a cut lip, and I thought I'd dislodged a tooth. But at least he was calm, and our enterprise could continue. Thus, we kidnapped him from his East Riding nest and conveyed him back across the river into North Riding. We drove into the town centre, and he located the bakery with its warm shed next door to the ovens. In the shed was an old armchair with horsehair sticking out and a hole in the cushion. But it was warm, cosy and dry. Once again, we manhandled Meth Morris from the car and cajoled him into his new location. Fortunately, he was enjoying that happy state between consciousness and drunkenness, and seemed to have forgotten all about the wild struggle of a few minutes earlier. He contentedly settled in the old armchair, and his head flopped to one side into the oblivion of a deep sleep. "Doesn't he look happy?" smiled Sergeant Bairstow, wincing as his black eye bore testimony to his kidnapping. "He's back home," I said. "He'll be fine. He'll sleep happily there till morning, and then he'll go on his way." And so we left him in his new place of abode. Sergeant Bairstow made his way back to Ashfordley, happy in the knowledge that his cells would not be polluted by this smelly fellow. The man was safe, dry, alive, and no trouble to anyone. I finished prompt at 1 o'clock that morning, and at 9 was back on duty in Ashfordley Police Station. Sergeant Bairstow came from his house, and he sported a gorgeous black eye. The telephone rang. Sergeant Bairstow answered it, and I heard him say, "Sir," to someone. "It's the inspector," he mouthed at me. "From Malton. Urgent. Don't leave yet. There might be a job for us." I waited as Sergeant Bairstow dealt with the call. There were a good many "no, sirs," "yes, sirs," and in the end he replaced the receiver, smiling broadly in spite of his bruises. "That was the inspector," he informed me. "You know that old meths man? He went into Malton Police Station this morning about 6 o'clock to complain about the North Riding Police." He told the inspector he'd been asleep in a coal barn full of straw when two nice East Riding officers, one with a helmet, had removed him to a warm barn full of hay. He remembers that, but then, according to him, two awful North Riding officers kidnapped him, assaulted him and made him sleep in a rickety armchair near a bakery. He's allergic to yeast, and now he's come out in spots. The inspector asked if we knew anything about it. He's checked with East Riding lads and they don't know. You told him no, Sergeant, I said. I said we had no knowledge of a meth drinker last night, Nick. And he accepted that. I put it to him. He has no option. Either he believes a drunken old meth drinker or he believes some of his most honourable officers. The man's fine, by the way. They've taken him to a place which will cure him, they hope. You better keep out of the inspector's way for a few days, then, I suggested. Why? He asked in all innocence. That black eye. It might take some explaining. My second problem with the body occurred soon afterwards. But the story really began during the First World War. A farm girl called Liza Stockdale lived in an isolated homestead high in Laresdale. She was born there at the turn of the century and lived her first 16 uneventful years on the farm. There she assisted round the place, looking after the hens and acting as milkmaid for her father with his busy dairy herd. Being always at work, she never travelled. She'd never been to Yorkshire and not even been to Malton. Twice before her 16th birthday, she'd visited Ashfordley on market day to buy livestock with her father, and that was the extent of her experience beyond the ranging dry stone walls of Scar End Farm. Then she met a soldier. A tall, dark and handsome soldier of 19 chanced this way on an exercise. He was in charge of a mighty gun which was being towed across the moors by a small platoon of young men. They camped near Scar End Farm, Laresdale, and bought milk and eggs from Liza. As in all good love stories, Liza fell hopelessly in love with this handsome visitor, and to cut a long story short, she ran away with him. They married soon after the 1914-18 war was over, and lived in North London, where her husband developed a successful business from a small draper's shop. They produced 4 lovely children, who were a credit to the happy pair, and in turn they produced a clutch of grandchildren who were also a credit to the family. Back in the remoteness of the North Yorkshire moors, Liza's relations continued to work in the hills. Time went by and the farming Stockdales prospered just as Liza had prospered in London. But there was one small blot on the happy horizon. Liza had never returned home. Having run away, she felt she had incurred the wrath of her mother and father. Consequently, she never ventured back to the family homestead. Furthermore, she deliberately kept her address secret and avoided all contact with her past. Throughout her long and happy life, however, she'd nursed a secret desire to be invited to the moorland home of her family. Her parents had died long ago, but she had not attended their funeral at Laresdale's isolated Methodist chapel. She had not been to the weddings of her brothers and sisters, nor to the christenings of their children. She had missed all this, and had often wondered about the Laresdale branch of her family. Sometimes she wished she'd had the guts to make contact. Liza's husband, however, was not the insensitive man the family considered him to be. At the time of the elopement during the First World War, he'd been an aggressive, cocksure young man, and it was his worldly manner that had captivated the young Liza. On marrying him and settling down to a hard-working life, she realised she truly loved him, and he truly loved her. Their love strengthened with the passing years, and Herbert often tried to persuade her to return to the farm, if only for a visit. He said she should write and make contact, but she never did. Something intangible restrained her. Some unknown hand or force denied Liza the thrill of returning to her homestead, and she contented herself with life in London. Herbert never forgot that she missed Scar End Farm. He knew of her love for the area and made many attempts to persuade her to make the move, but she stubbornly and steadfastly refused. Herbert vowed one day he would surprise her and take her home. She would not know where she was going until she arrived. He'd book a holiday in a nice hotel in Scarborough or York, and would hire a taxi to take her into the hills of Laresdale and to the farm which he'd discovered was still in the family. But somehow that trip never materialised. Business was too demanding, the family too busy, or time too short. It was always something he'd do when he had the time, and he never did have the time. Finally, Liza died of a heart attack. Her caring husband, Herbert Franklin, a retired draper, loved her more in death. And as he wept alone that night, he made a resolution that Liza would at last return to her native moorland dale. He telephoned Pastor Smith at the manse to ask whether she could be buried in his tiny churchyard at Laresdale, and specified that it had been his wish to have Liza cremated. The burial, if permitted, would involve a small urn of Liza's ashes, and Herbert alone would accompany them. All he asked was a simple chapel service to place Liza in her resting place, and he did not tell Pastor Smith of her family links with his district, save to say it was her wish to be buried there. He'd asked his own family not to attend. They paid their respects at the crematorium, and this was to be his personal pilgrimage. He wanted to repay the wrong he'd done all those years ago. Pastor Smith agreed without question, and so the small interment was arranged for a day in late June. Herbert Franklin left King's Cross Station in London in the early hours of that Saturday, carrying a suitcase. In the suitcase were his overnight things and a dark suit for the funeral. Also in the case was a silver casket containing the ashes of Liza, his beloved wife. It bore her maiden name, Liza Stockdale, and was carefully wrapped in tissue paper and tucked among his clothes. The train left King's Cross on time, and Herbert settled down to his long trip north, eagerly awaiting his arrival at York. A taxi was to take him across the hills into Laresdale, where at 2 o'clock precisely Pastor Smith would conduct the burial ceremony. Liza would be home at last. At York, Herbert Franklin took his case from the rack, left the train and caught a taxi out of York. At 12:15 he was knocking on my door at Aidensfield Police House. I answered the knock to find a lightly built man in his 60s. He clutched a rather battered brown leather suitcase, and I noticed a taxi waiting outside my house. Yes, I was enjoying a day off and was clad in old clothes because I was in the middle of decorating a bedroom. I looked more like a painter and decorator than a policeman. Is the policeman in?" he asked. "I'm the policeman." I wiped my hands on my paint-stained trousers. "P.C. Rowan." "Oh, well, I'm sorry to bother you," he began, "but it is important." "You'd better come in." I invited him to enter my office. "Will the taxi wait?" "Yes, I've asked him to." And he entered my office, removing his hat as he did so. "Now, sir," I made a formal greeting, "how can I help you?" He placed his battered suitcase on my desk and opened it. Inside was a collection of assorted clothes and personal belongings, and I waited for some enlightenment. "Officer," he said, "I left London this morning from King's Cross, and I put my suitcase on the rack. It contained my overnight things and a dark suit. I looked at the contents of this case. This belonged to a woman, for there were feminine underclothes, perfumes, and so forth. So this isn't yours?" He shook his head, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I must have picked up the wrong case," he said despondently. "Mine is exactly like this one, officer, and when I got off at York, I must have collected this. It's got stickers on, you see, and mine was plain, so I should have noticed, but I didn't spot them until I was almost here in the taxi." "So yours is still on the train?" I ventured. He nodded. "Look, Mr. Franklin," he said. "Herbert Franklin. Look, Mr. Franklin, there's no need to get upset. I'm sure we can trace your case very soon. I'll ring the British Transport Police at York and ask them to search the train at its next stop. There is one problem, Mr. Rowan. Yes? In my case, he faltered in his short speech, there is a small silver casket. Yes? It contains ashes, officer, the ashes of my dear wife, Liza. And he could contain himself no longer. He burst into a flood of tears. After a short time he dried his tears and apologised for his lapse, making a brave attempt to control himself. I asked if he could give some indication of the location of the coach in which he travelled. Was it near the front, the middle, the rear, before or after the restaurant car? Gradually, I produced some idea of his whereabouts on that fateful train, and having satisfied myself on the time of his departure from King's Cross, I rang the railway police in York. The casket, I said, once I was sure the railway police were in action. Is it recognisable for what it is? It's a nice casket, he said. The lid is firmly secured, and on the side there's a panel with her name. It just says Liza Stockdale. I used her maiden name because she's home, you see. Or she was coming home. He told me all about his wife's links with this area, and I felt it did him good to tell me all about his romance and marriage. Well, I said eventually, the Transport Commission police will search the train when it gets to Newcastle or Edinburgh. Are you staying in the area? I'm at the Ashfordley Hotel in Ashfordley, he said. I've booked in for tonight. But you see, I've arranged for a funeral at Laresdale at 2 o'clock today. I'll ring Pastor Smith, I said. If your suitcase turns up, they'll see that it is sent back to York, and it could be back with you today. You might only have to delay matters a short while. Look, Mr. Franklin, you go to your hotel now and have lunch. Stay there until I ring you. I'll let you know the minute I hear something. And Pastor Smith, I know him personally. I soothed him. I'll explain the problem, and I know he won't mind. He'll only be too pleased to accommodate you at a time convenient to you both. At 4:45, P.C. Hall from the Transport Police called my office. Hall here, BT Police, he said. We've searched the entire train, but that case isn't there. It stopped at Thirsk, Northallerton, Darlington, Durham and Newcastle before we searched it, so the case must have been removed by the owner of the one you've got. She's bound to realise the mistake sooner or later and call us. I'd appreciate a call. It's rather urgent, I said. It's just a lost suitcase, isn't it? He retorted, having dealt with thousands like this. No, it's more than that. I decided to explain, and he listened carefully. A poor old codger, he cried. Oh, bloody hell. Look, I'll have our lads give the train another going over in Edinburgh, but I'm not too hopeful. I'll ask our lost and found property people to check their records for today as well. The poor old devil. I rang Pastor Smith to explain the situation, upon which he murmured his condolences, and then I rang the hotel to speak to Mr. Franklin. I told him the result to date, but stressed the BT police were making further searches. He appeared resigned to the fact that his beloved Liza was lost forever, but said he'd stay at the hotel for 2 or 3 days, if necessary. Sunday was another rest day for me, and I intended to complete the painting and decorating which had been interrupted yesterday. At 10:30 I was in the middle of slapping some wallpaper on the bedroom wall, when there was a loud knocking on my front door. A large, unkempt farmer in his early 40s stood there in corduroy trousers and a dark sweater, while a Land Rover waited outside. I didn't know him. Morning. Is that Bobby? I noticed he had a brown suitcase in his hand. Yes, I said. I'm decorating. I'm P.C. Rowan. Oh, well, this is important. And he held up the case. Can I come in? He followed me into the office. This is a funny sort of going on. Yon case isn't our lass's, he said brusquely. But she got it off London train yesterday, by accident, she reckons. The London train? My heart missed a beat. Aye, she's at university, Dudley, and come up yesterday for a break. She's getting a brown case just like this, and somebody's switched them. I reckon somebody's got hers, and they must know by now, so I thought I'd tell you fellas. Well, there's nobody in at Ashfordly, so I thought I'd better come here, 'cause thou's nearest Bobby. Did you look inside the case? I asked. She did, and I did a quick peep. Not a nosy peep, the nose, but enough to see it's a fella's suit and bits and bobs. There's something wrapped in tissue paper, but I didn't open it up. That's not my business. I lifted the other case from the floor and placed it on my desk, flipping open the lid. I saw the amazement on his face. Is this your daughter's stuff? I asked. No, that's a capper. No, that's a real capper. I'd say it was her stuff, but she's in Land Rover. I'll shout her. A tall, pretty teenager ran into my office, smiling at her father as he pointed to the case on my desk. Is yon case thine, lass? She blushed at the lingerie and clothing which was on display and said, Oh, yes, it is. Good heavens, how? I decided not to mention the contents of the article wrapped in tissue paper, but did tell them about the poor gentleman who picked up the wrong case when he got off at York. The girl told me she got off the train at Thirsk, where her father had met her in the Land Rover, and she'd not realised the mistake until late last night. She'd put her case on the top of her wardrobe at home. Then she'd found the man's stuff inside and had not investigated further. This was the typical action of an honest Dales person. They did not snoop into things that weren't their business. I was highly relieved. I pushed aside the tissue covers of the casket and saw the silver beneath, but did not enlighten this couple of its significance. Now there were the usual formalities to complete. The girl would have to sign for her case, and I'd have to record her as the finder of the second case. Eventually, Mr. Franklin would sign for his own goods. Right, I said. You are the owner of the case of ladies' clothes. The girl nodded. I have to make an official record of your receipt of this case, I explained. What's your name? Stockdale, she said. Liza Stockdale. I had the name half written in my book before I realised its significance. I felt faint. Liza Stockdale, from Crag-Inn Farm, Laresdale. Summat up? Asked her father. I didn't know how to broach this one. Why is she called Liza? I heard myself ask. Oh, it's after an aunt of mine, he said. I never knew her, but she cleared off with a soldier way back in First World War and never came back. My dad, that was her brother, thought the world of her, and she never wrote or anything. He always talked about her, my dad did. So I called my first lass after her, just to keep name going the seas for my dad. So the family wanted her to come back? Aye, of course. Yon soldier was a nice chap by all accounts, did the right thing by her, he did. We lost touch. She was only member of our family to do a thing like that. Headstrong lass, they said. But all right, not a disgrace to us. Is your father still alive? I asked gently. Is thou all right, Mr. Rowan? He asked me. Thou's gone all pale and shaky. Aye, my dad's alive. He's turned 75 now, but as fit as a fiddle. Look, I said, you better sit down, both of you. And I pulled up chairs for them. Nay, lad, thou better sit down. He laughed, but he took the seat. I don't know how to tell you this. Summat wrong? Mr. Stockdale and Liza, I said. Yesterday a man called at this house with your suitcase. He'd come up from London and had got off at York, one stop before you, Liza. He mistakenly took your suitcase and realised when he was on his way to Ashfordly by taxi. He called here and he left it with me, and I tried to trace that other case, his case, which he'd left on the train. The railway police are still looking for it. She smiled. And I got off at Thirsk, taking it with me because it was the only one left, and because it was just like my own. Yes, I said. Now, this is the sad bit. That old man was on his way to a funeral, his wife's funeral. She died last week in London. He was bringing her ashes to be buried near her home.
Oh, she said. And I had them in that case?
Yes, I said. This is the casket, and I lifted the tissue-wrapped casket from its resting place among the smart clothes of Mr. Franklin. I removed the wrappings and revealed the name. I turned it towards them so they could read it.
Liza Stockdale,
the girl gasped.
My name.
Her father's gaze never left me. "Thou means this is my Aunt Liza's ashes?" I nodded. "Bye," he said. "Bye. And she came home after all. Right back to Scar End, and by hand of her namesake. No, that cap's out." I handed the casket over, and his big, clumsy hands lovingly cradled it. "Oh, said there was going to be a funeral." "It should have been yesterday, Mr. Stockdale, and Pastor Smith was going to conduct it. He wouldn't realise that Mr. Franklin, who'd arranged it, was a relation of yours." "And that poor chap thought we didn't care?" "Yes." "Then thou and me and old Liza will have to put him right, Mr. Rowan. Come on, let's find him."
"But I'm in my mess."
"That doesn't matter, lad. Fetch yon cases. Liza, sign up. Let's be off."
We found Mr. Franklin sitting in the lounge of the Ashfordley Hotel reading the Sunday papers. He looked pale and sickly, but smiled when he saw me. His smile turned to clear relief as he saw the young girl carrying 2 identical suitcases towards him. He stood up to welcome the curious party consisting of a policeman in decorating gear, a farmer, and a pretty girl. "You were on the train." He smiled at Liza. "I'm so sorry. It was all my fault." "Is that my case, officer?" The relief was evident in his voice. Liza handed the case over to him. "Oh, it's so kind of you," he said. "It did cause me a lot of distress." Liza was weeping openly now. She put her own case on the floor and said, "Dad, tell him, please." The poor old man looked horrified. I wondered if he'd thought she'd thrown away the ashes or destroyed them.
"Nay, I can't. I'm all overcome."
And I saw tears of happiness and emotion in the big farmer's eyes. Mr. Franklin looked at each of us for an explanation, and I knew I had to speak. "Mr. Franklin," I said, "this girl's name is Liza Stockdale, and she lives at Crag End Farm, Laresdale." There was a long, long pause, and suddenly Mr. Franklin flung his arms around the girl, crying, "Liza, Liza." On the day following, Monday, there was a large, hurriedly arranged family funeral at the tiny chapel of Laresdale, and Mr. Franklin stayed at Crag End Farm for a long, long time.